Okay, right. Welcome back yet again, everybody. I'm assuming that you can hear me. So I'd want to introduce to you John Crosbie and Graham Hill, who are going to be presenting the next session on inclusive outdoors. John's a consultant on inclusion, and he works with ALA, and he also works with Graham in their role of as part of the Adventure for All group connected to IOL, and that group advises both mountain training and the BMC through its equity steering group. And you may have in the past been on one of Graham's courses, Climbing for All, which are delivered through Climbing Walls and have had a great impact on increasing inclusivity in practice and in climbing. Without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to you, gentlemen.
Okay, so I'm going to run the first session of this, so it's going to be a little bit theory based. I haven't tried to run a presentation on Zoom before, so bear with me if it ends up as a bit clunky. I have got a couple of sessions where I'd like to try and engage you by using the chat box. So if you could have that open and available and share your thoughts as I kind of ask questions, then I can just have a look at what you're thinking and where we go from there. So you're all aware of the kind of criteria for this session, that it is being recorded, etc., etc. So you've been to enough, so I'll leave that one as it is. And I'll get on with the bits which I want to talk about, which is inclusion in climbing and mountaineering. My first question is really, just have a quick think about what do you understand inclusion to mean? I so oft used word, but it actually seems to have different meanings to different people. And then what do you think are the implications of inclusion in a climbing and mountaineering environment? So just going to give you a half a minute just to think about that, if I can. Okay. So what does inclusion mean? And then, having thought about what we're using as the term inclusion, how do we think that inclusion in a climbing and mountaineering differ from an integrated climbing and mountaineering experience, or a segregated climbing, exclusive climbing, or even specialist or specialized climbing? Again, these are terms which kind of end up being used and all subtly different meanings, or actually quite significantly different meanings. So if you could just think about those and just think to yourself, are any of these particularly good and bad? And here we are, I'm going to try it. Do you want to give any thoughts about any of that on the chat box, please? And there's a prize for the first person to get some form of cohesive response on the chat box on the meanings of any of those.
Does that include me, John, in terms of?
Yeah, you can have you can, but you don't get the prize. That's great. Thanks, Chris, Robert, Andy. Well done. Okay. Oh, segregated as most problems. Okay. Okay. Some good thoughts there, folks. I'm gonna kind of add a few bits and pieces here. Okay. So what does inclusive mean? I'm not that clever, so I use a dictionary to come up with definitions and then try and apply them. So the inclusive definition is including as part of the whole. So it's one provision which is for everybody. And if we take another definition or an extension of it, which is including all of the expected or required items. And therefore, if we think about the whole range of people we may want to include, or looking at disabilities, the whole range of people with disabilities we do want to take into account, I think we've got a bit of a challenge there. You know, I think the physical, intellectual and sensory requirements of climbing and mountaineering do not make the inclusion of people with disabilities easy. You know, the fact is that, you know, climbing is a physical activity. Someone with a physical impairment is not going to find that easy. There are intellectual elements of learning how to tie knots or map read or whatever, you know, which is going to make people with intellectual impairments struggle. And in the same way, the people with sensory impairments are going to not obtain the same communications or information that someone without that impairment will have. So we have a challenge here, and some form of compromises are going to be required. So looking at some of these other terms I just threw up there, integrate, again, dictionary definitions is combine or be combined to form a whole. So inclusion is kind of having the one body fixes all, but to integrate could have a segregated or different activity or different level of activity for different people. And I think it was Jay there who kind of made some comment on to that effect of going, it's the same as many other things in society. I mean, school groups, I mean, I know I was in the C grade, but you know, there was a B grade and an A grade. In football, there's the Premier Division and the other divisions. So integration doesn't deny anybody access. They get included, but included a level which is potentially appropriate to themselves. So, you know, inclusion can take a different form. Segregation, I think we've got to kind of comment that segregation may not be potentially good. Okay, so definitions is set apart from the rest, and one of them was separate along racial, sexual, religious or disability lines. Now, as a sport, particularly as we get into the competitive element, we segregate anyway, don't we? I mean, women's climbing competitions are segregated from men's climbing competitions. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be negative to segregate. It's just got to be thought through how and why we're doing this. And my machine has seized. Okay, gone again. Okay, so what about exclusive, not admitting others, or denying access to something? Okay, again, that can be positive, that can be negative. What's the purpose of that exclusion? I mean, when I go to a hotel, I kind of take a really nice exclusive hotel because there's no smelly climbers in there. You know, I don't want to be leveled with them, you know. In the same way as if you're doing something which is different and you look at the single gender, the women's only programs for climbing and mountaineering, they are exclusive. They do not admit male participants. Yeah, that can be positive for those who are remaining in the group. So again, not necessarily a negative element. And specialized, again, that's a kind of an element where you're looking at concentrating or becoming an expert in a particular skill area. And if you have concentrated on that in a climbing environment, whether it's ice climbing or trad climbing, do you need to go and spend your time on an area which isn't in your field as a climber? Do you have to be doing mountain leadership courses when you're a climber? Not necessarily. That's what I do, and that's what I do well. And in part of my previous work with Graham, we worked at a specialist centre which only took people with disabilities. To take anybody else who was not disabled would have actually denied access to facilities for people who were disabled. So why would we do that? We'd do it to be inclusive, but actually as a charity, we weren't an inclusive provision. We were a specialist provision which segregated disabled people and was exclusive to them. And that's what they wanted. So none of these terms are necessarily bad. You know, it's just being aware where people could be. And this little diagram here just kind of says there's not one thing which fits all. So across the top here, I put the provision type from inclusion on the left, segregation on the right, and down the vertical axis, we've got experts at the top and novices at the bottom. So someone with a disability may wish to start in a segregated environment where they actually have the time and facilities to enable them to get to know what they're doing. And as they actually say, climbing is something for me, they may want to go and join, for example, a specialist mountaineering club for people with disabilities, or a branch within a club which has a kind of disabled group working within it. And finally, as they get out the top and become an expert themselves, they may want to go on expeditions without disabled people, just a fully inclusive expedition, because the expedition is going, say, to Everest, and they happen to want to go there. They can go there, and that's an inclusive expedition. Other people, let's take someone like Jesse Dufton, who has grown up in a inclusive environment in his climbing. He has only been taken as a novice with his father climbing, and as he gained experience, he's remained within clubs, and now as an expert, his climbing is the same as anybody else's. And in comparison, you've got someone like, and I'll take a different sport, Oscar Pistorius as a runner, started off as a segregated Paralympian. As he grew up here, got to the top in the Paralympics, beating the world record, and then found actually he was competitive at the Olympics and went to the Olympics. So his sporting pathway was through the segregated to inclusion. And you may say someone like Jesse Dufton may go up through the inclusive route to expert, and then if he wanted to become a paraclimber, go into the segregated one. So no right, no wrong. It's just the sporting pathways through the activity. So quick thoughts. We've used inclusive. This session is about including people with disabilities, but they're not the only people who need including. So quick thoughts. What else? Which other groups are at risk of being or feeling included? Okay, I'm sure we can all think of a few. Okay, and therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leap to the Equality Act, which brought together a whole bunch of legislation, and part of it identified what they called protective characteristics. So these are the characteristics which are included in the Equality Act. There's disability, race, religion or belief, sex or gender, sexual orientation, age, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnerships, and pregnancy and maternity. In the climbing world, I think the first half dozen are areas that we may want to be thinking about doing something to help include them. And certainly the British Mountaineering Council's equity group looks at disability, race, closely linked to religion because of the cultural elements of the religious related to Asian populations, sex, and now including sexual orientation. So that's the 5 there. These other things I don't think kind of become particularly materialistic if we're looking at inclusive issues at the moment. So these people with these characteristics have barriers to participation, which is why inclusion is an issue for us. So what I'd like you to do, please, is just to think about some of the reasons why, and I'm going to focus on disabled people, why they may be feeling excluded, and what, or asking the same question in a different way, what factors can prevent disabled people from participating in climbing and mountaineering. So if you could use the chat box again, please, to share your thoughts, and I'm going to give you just a minute to achieve that. So good luck to getting out something in that period, please. Okay, folks, that's pretty stunning. Having read through that lot, there's a whole bunch of stuff which is looking really good. So I could say I don't need to start my slide because it's all come through the chat box, but there's a bunch of kind of recognized elements which most people have kind of covered there. So personal expectations or perceptions of the sport, massive barrier, their confidence to participate, as has been raised, the attitude of the coaches or others engaging in that, and the knowledge. Health and safety didn't see come up, but that's people concerned about, is this a risky sport for me? But somebody did mention gatekeepers and the ability of gatekeepers, parents, care workers, teachers, of saying, actually, this isn't something I want to do, therefore it's unsafe for the person I'm in charge of to do, therefore we won't do it. Financial factors, you can see a few there, and then there's all the transport, venue accessibility, communications for people with hearing impairments or visually impaired to get information, the equipment's come up. Time and pace of the activity, that can be quite challenging. If your group or standard practice will go at that pace, but somebody's very conscious that they're not going to go at that pace or learning, it's going to be too fast for them. And role models has been mentioned, so absolutely great. So thank you very much indeed for that. And therefore, this time I'm going to ask of kind of which of these might we be able to address as providers, and which are outside our powers of providers to address. And again, if you can just kind of use a couple of minutes to share your thoughts about which ones we can address, which ones we can't. And I'm just going to put up that screen again, just you might want to pick one to think about, and come up with a response on that one too, please. Okay, they seem to be kind of slowing down as they come in. Oh yeah, no, here comes a whole bunch more. Great. Some good thoughts there, and as we can see, some of those maybe outside our control as providers. Some, as Jay has said, some organizations are in a position to be able to offset the increased cost of provision. We can do things. Role models can overcome personal perceptions, but how do we actually get more role models in the media? There's challenges to us there, aren't there? Yeah, keep coming in. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, keep running with those. If you get some more thoughts, I'm just going to roll along with this. Okay, so as providers, if we are serious about including people with disabilities, Mazdu, who I've taken this diagram from, wasn't a nuclear physicist, but he did kind of provide a model of saying it's got to be pretty holistic what we do to include people with disabilities. And the people are the center of his model, and quite rightly so. We're kind of into a people-centered activity. And therefore, once we're focusing on those people, the organizational philosophy is key. And I fully support that. If people can get their philosophy right, then everything else kind of slightly falls into place. And it's being honest with that philosophy too. For some people, some providers fully recognize, their priority has to be the survival of their own business, the support of their family. That's why they're doing this. Yeah, there'll be a love of climbing or whatever, but they're running a business as a business, as their income, their employment. And if their philosophy is financially based, there's nothing wrong with that, but just be clear that that's going to affect everything else. In the same way that if your philosophy is social justice and you believe in those equal opportunities rather than financial, and as Jay said, you might be able to find money to deliver, then that's going to take your organization in a different direction when including people with disabilities. So philosophy is key. And once you've actually sorted out your philosophy, then your policies, obviously written policies if you're a large organization, but actually how you go about delivering that philosophy as a policy of inclusion, whether you're going to run separate courses or whatever it is, that's up to you, but that's driven by your philosophy. And your policies then kind of will lead yourself to the programs you offer, You know, which programs are they? How long are they? We talked about extending time periods for delivering programs. May have to be longer. You know, that's in the design of your programs. Then how do you sell this product you've now decided to run to people with disabilities? Because if it's not available to them or they don't know about it, they aren't going to participate, and you know, there's a waste of time. So you know, that promotion is important, again, in a media which is possible for them to access. Okay, then people have mentioned again places. You know, have you got the locations which are suitable for the clients that you're going to be working with? If it's a climbing wall, has it got wheelchair access or whatever it is? You know, if you're in the mountains, are there suitable crags for you to use? Then you go on to the processes of how do I actually deliver this activity? That may be down to your teaching style, of how that fits into the program. And finally, and without this one, you've got nothing, because if the people who you're aiming at don't perceive it to be accessible, that, particularly with social media nowadays, is to go out and say, these people actually don't know what they're doing. You know, we had a really bad experience, or, you know, this is the greatest experience in the world. Everybody should come to this provider because it is so good. So, you know, it's a very holistic element, and excuse the kind of all peas by Mr. Maslow, but I think it kind of just made it feel simple to him. Right, moving on. Okay, I'm going to jump back to the Equality Act for a couple of seconds, because there's a few things as a provider the Equality Act does cover, and as climbing providers, access to goods and services. We are a service provider, therefore we fall under the Act. If you're climbing wall or own property, you also got to be aware that the Act applies to retrospective adaptations to buildings, i.e. you've got to go back and look how you can make your building accessible. If you're an employer, it applies to employment too. And then I think the rest of these are slightly less important to not important. So the Act requires people who require to comply with it. Two main things really which affect us. You need to make reasonable adjustments to your provision, and you must not treat a disabled person less favorably. So reasonable adjustments, that's kind of contextualized, of going, okay, what might be reasonable to one person? I've mentioned the financial pressures that are on some providers, that if you're a small provider, it is not reasonable for you to go out and buy a whole bunch of adaptive equipment in case somebody wants to use it. If you're a specialist centre with a lot of charitable money, it may be very reasonable to expect you to have that equipment. In the same way, an example in a retail scenario, you know, the little corner shop with an upstairs sales room may not be reasonable to put in a lift. For Tesco's or Marks and Spencer's, it's incredibly reasonable to put in a lift to get to their second floor because they make X million pounds per year. What does a small provider have to do to make a reasonable adjustment? Got to say, well, actually, somebody coming into the shop who can't go onto that second floor, how can I reasonably provide them with the same level of service? If it's, let's say, a clothing retailer, you know, the person wants to buy a man's suit, which is on the top floor. Well, what kind of suit are you looking for? 3-piece suit, what kind of color? Dark. Well, the sale assistant can go upstairs, grab a range of dark 3-piece suits and bring them down to show the customer. That is a reasonable adjustment. In the same way, for example, in a restaurant, it may not be reasonable to expect a restaurant to produce a braille menu. The reasonable adjustment might be for the waiter to read out the menu for the participant. And treating somebody less favorably, and I think we might be kind of coming to challenges here, as people actually haven't always thought through how they treat non-disabled people. So, for example, in a climbing wall, if you're going in there, you normally make either a declaration of competencies, or you might be asked to demonstrate you can fit a harness, tie a knot, and belay safely. If you're someone with disability coming in, that's what you must be asked to do. If it's a visually impaired person and you say, well, actually, how can you do a hazard assessment if there's somebody climbing near you who might be causing a hazard? You haven't actually asked the non-disabled person to do that. Therefore, asking the disabled person to suddenly do a hazard assessment is not treating them with the same fairness, or it is treating them less favorably than the non-disabled person. So you may find yourself in an awkward situation there. So what are the penalties for failing to comply with the Equity Act? Okay, just give me a quick guesstimate of what you think the penalties might be. The maximum penalties, what you might think they might be if you discriminate against a disabled person, please. 30 seconds to put in your guess. Prize for the highest bidder, prize for the lowest bidder. £5,007. Thank you. 1,000, that's low. Oops, yep, 1,000's looking good. Any more bids? Still 3,000, middle of the range. Oh, 10, going 10, 10. Yep, £10,000, fine. Yeah, that's good. Does it depend? No, it doesn't depend, Julie. Okay, this might be, ooh. Well, that was meant to be 500 quid, cheapskate. Okay, it's actually compensation without limitation. Okay, so there is no upper limit of what you might be fined. It depends really on, you know, does it depend? Yeah, it depends on the offence that you have caused the individual and this disquiet you've caused them. So compensation without limitation is the penalty. So just be aware of that one when you're thinking about discriminating. Okay, so people keep on saying, what's the definition of disability? How do I know they're disabled? The Equality Act actually does provide a useful definition, which is a physical or mental impairment which has substantial long-term adverse effects on person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So they're the key words, you know, substantial, long-term, and to be able to carry out day-to-day activities. Okay, so quite a useful definition that. Okay, I'm going to briefly talk now about models of disabilities, because if we're trying to include someone with a disability, we need to be aware of how they view themselves in the world, and it just avoids people making mistakes. And I know some of you will be familiar with these. I'm not going to spend much time, but I am just going to talk about them briefly. So there's a medical model of disability. This kind of takes the viewpoint that there is something wrong with the individual that needs to be fixed. So a blind person, if we could just make them see, all the problems will go away. The wheelchair user, if they could walk, there won't be an issue. Therefore, the concentration is on that the person is a problem. We need to fix the person. Once the person's been fixed, everything else will be fine. And people with disabilities who are in a long-term scenario, in terms of, you know, they're never going to get better, there's no point in trying to fix them. It's not going to happen. Even Superman, Chris Reeves, you know, with all his money, tried to stand again, you know, and he really didn't. And it ends up being a very negative viewpoint of the individual. They're the problem. There's something wrong with them. Fix them. There's a completely alternative model which turns this one on its head. And this is the one which is preferred by disabled people, and it's called the social model of disability. And that turns around and says, actually, there's nothing wrong with me. We're all individuals with a difference. I may not be able to see, I may not be able to walk, but I'm still an individual and a valuable member of society. The problem is society has failed to take into account my needs as an individual. It's not that I can't walk, which prevents me from getting into that building. It's because the architects have put a flight of steps there rather than a ramp. So you in society has disabled me by not designing a building which fits me. In the same way, it's not the fact that they can't see, that a blind person can't access information about your products as a provider. It's the fact that you don't provide that information in a format which they can access. It's not in Braille, it's not in audio. So the problem isn't theirs, the problem is ours. And people with disabilities see that as a far more positive way of looking at themselves and disabilities. Okay, and there are other elements here, and you can see them down here: poverty, low income, poor job prospects. Very few people relatively with a disability have a job, therefore they are impoverished, they have quite high expenses for life, therefore that is what disables them, is their lack of access to funds. Unfortunately, a true social model of disability, when we look at climbing, fine, Everest would be fine if it was wheelchair accessible. Well, that ain't going to happen. Therefore, as climbers, people working in, activities, we need to look at a different model. And what can be quite useful is this functional model of disability. So we need to be aware of what the limitations are of the individual so we can take these into account. So it's not the fact that that person has a particular label or has a particular issue, but we do need to know what they can do. We do need to know what they can't do, and we don't need to worry about the medical label. So if we're trying to run a session and we have somebody with a single arm amputee or a limited use of that arm, we've got to be aware of that rather than expecting them to climb a climb which requires two arms. And once you're aware of that, then we can start compensating and including them into the activities that we offer. So I'll just recap there. So the medical model is there's something wrong with the person, it should be fixed. Social model is something's wrong with society, which causes people to be disabled. And the functional model is that we need to be aware of the limitations so we can take account of these. There is quite an interesting and useful further model, which really becomes very personal or person-centered, and that's the dreadfully named biopsychosocial model of disability, and this diagram kind of leads to it. So you could see the functional model as the overlap between the biological factors of disability and the social community that person lives in, and that's the compromise. What it doesn't take into account is really the individual's psyche, the personality of the individual. So taking example, and I'm kind of assuming you all know Jesse Dufton at the moment, that Jesse is blind. However, he's been brought up in a social community where his father's taken him climbing, his girlfriend climbs, he goes climbing, and he's had that opportunity. But it's not just that, it's what has Jesse wanted to do? Where has Jesse come from in terms of attitude and desire for his own activity? And having the blindness, having that social group, and being Jesse himself with the drive he has ended up in this middle as an individual doing what he does. In the same way, you could quite easily, somebody with the same disability, possibly with the same social background and opportunity, but being a different character, may not want to climb at all. They might be much happier sitting at home on an Xbox. Or somebody else, again, with the same disability, but with a social community who never provided the opportunity to go climbing, again, whatever their drive is, they're very unlikely to achieve a climbing outcome. So you can see that this becomes an overlap between all of those three elements, and that's kind of quite a good way of looking at things. So as providers, we need to be able to do a few things to try and help ourselves get a bit more inclusive. The tree model, there's a few models of inclusion in sporting activities, but I think the tree one is the most useful for a climbing or outdoor based activity. Obviously the initials stand for things. So the T is teaching or coaching. And I'm sure you've all come across the little kind of phrase of teach the person, not the sport. You know, the sport is less important than the person in front of you. What do they want to get out of it? Not what does the sport contain intrinsically itself. So there's no point in teaching someone who's a double leg amputee a heel hook if it's something they're never going to do. Teach them what they need to know to be able to participate in the sport. And to help with this, you know, you need to use either appropriate language or an approach that meets that climber's needs. So I think you'll have all have come across VARC as a, you know, a kind of teaching tool, or VAC, VARC, or now VARCU, if you want. If you're not familiar, it's the kind of visual, auditory, reading, kinesthetic. And now I've kind of thrown in YouTube at the end as ways that people gain information to enable them to participate in the sport. So, you know, we may need to adjust some of these. There's no point for someone with a visual impairment to be doing visual demonstrations or making a long auditory explanation to someone who's got a hearing impairment. So what I'd just like to do, if you could please, is just take 3 minutes just to think of ways in which you can adapt your teaching or coaching for just one of the following groups. Someone with a visual impairment or a hearing impairment, somebody with an intellectual impairment, somebody with autistic spectrum disorder, or someone with ADHD. So again, just pick one, just think through one, hopefully you know more about than the others, and say, well, okay, how could I adapt my activities, my teaching style, which then more fits in with their needs than maybe how I'd normally do it. Again, you feel free to use the chat box if you want to throw in a thought or two. If not, just give you 3 minutes just to kind of have a think through and maybe jot down a few notes to yourself. Okay. A nice little quote, I missed the name of saying, no idea, but hopefully I'm going to find out. Well, I can quite easily help you there. Attend one of Graham's Climbing for All courses. Unfortunately, we don't kind of have the time to look at all of these in detail. You can see some ideas coming up on the chat box, which is great. So, you know, have a look at that. But it's just kind of, as yeah, the couple of examples I gave you, you know, you're not going to give a visual demonstration to someone who's blind, but maybe a longer oral explanation, maybe a tactile explanation, actually even putting hands on and demonstrating, you know, exactly or tactilely what climbing walls look like or what the knots look like or whatever it is. So it's going to be you using your skills as a deliverer to think about those issues, and especially if you know you've got someone coming in with some of those disabilities, you know, have a bit of pre-thinking before they arrive. Okay, so that's us teaching. Don't know if it's okay. The next one of the three is the rules or regulations. Again, what we need to do to make sure we're more inclusive is not to be anal about the rules or details or ethics of something like climbing. You know, Cara produced this inclusion wheel, which gives some ideas of what is possible. You know, so they kind of graded a range of activities between an activity for which no modifications is required to include someone with disabilities. Obviously, these are the perfect ones if we can do it, you know, and someone like Jesse Dufton climbing the Old Man of Hoy, you know, absolutely perfect. No modifications was required. He just went and climbed that that stack, you know, didn't need anything. In other sporting environments, just examples would include, you know, running, people who run the marathon who are blind, archery in the Olympics, there's quite a few wheelchair archers. It's an activity they can do without any modification. The second one is trying to make minor modifications. And again, I'll give a climbing example of, say, a climbing competition. Someone with a visual impairment may be allowed a guide, a sighted guide to guide them towards where the holes are, something most likely not allowed in a standard climbing competition, but it's a modification to enable that person to compete. Other sports, the one I normally use is wheelchair tennis. You know, the only modification to the rules to allow a wheelchair tennis player to participate is to allow a second bounce of the ball. Everything else is the same. You then come into major modifications. And again, for a climber, say with somebody with a leg amputee who may be struggling because of the grade of the climb, to use a bit of aid climbing, either by placing a bit of protection and using a sling for their non-functioning limb to be able to hang off because they can't use a standard hold. Well, does it actually matter? That person's on the rock, enjoying the sport we all enjoy, and they're just treating it slightly different. They don't have to worry about the ethics. They want to get the most out of the activity. Then there's elements like what you could call activities primarily for people with disabilities. That would be setting up in a climbing wall a free hanging rope, which you could Jumar on for somebody who has no lower limb capacity or you know, function. So a wheelchair user, they could Jumar up using a system which, yeah, if you wanted to be competitive, maybe a non-disabled person could compete against them alongside in the same activity. You know, it doesn't matter, but it is an option, but it would be set up for them primarily because it's not something, if you're having a Jumar in competition, you'd normally use your legs, but so what? Let's see if we can, okay. There's the obvious non-playing roles where people in sport can be officials or judges. The one which comes to mind in a climbing environment is someone with disability belaying from a wheelchair rather than participating. I must say I find that a little bit of a cop-out. It's not really engaging with the spirit of the activity, and therefore to find something which would be more suited, and unless that's what they wanted to do, would be more appropriate. And finally, you could look at things which are only for people with disabilities, and their example I'd come up with something like wheelchair abseiling. Why would a non-disabled person wheelchair abseil apart from just experience if they wanted to do it? But it doesn't really meet any additional needs. And the other sport environment, which is kind of comparative, is wheelchair racing, as in the picture, and quite interesting with the marathons, things like the London Marathon. A number of non-wheelchair users wish to compete in wheelchairs as they thought they'd have a better chance of doing well. and they weren't permitted to do so. So thinking about that, if we are going to adapt our activity rules, there's a few things you need to just be aware of. Try and maintain the integrity of the activity as closely as possible. Keep the level of challenge appropriate. Okay, if there is a question, involve the participants in making that decision if that's what they want to do. Only make changes if you need to. And finally, and really pertinent, it may not be possible to include all of the people all of the time. And again, those compromises have to be made. So that's teaching, that's the rules, the environment. Going to touch on a few things in the environment and environmental management. Okay, we can change our physical location. We can choose crags, mountains, routes which are more appropriate to the participants. We may have to change our staffing ratios. If we've got people who are struggling from one side or another, having more staff there can help. The choice of equipment can make a difference. And the last one, communications and backup, you may kind of question that one. But if you're looking at people with disabilities going into remote environments where a non-disabled group may be able to extract themselves or not have the same medical needs, but to enable somebody with a disability to go in there, they need to be able to get out again. It's something one may want to consider. I'm going to look at a few risk management issues as part of that as well. We often perceive a lot of risk, or a lot of people without experience perceive risk, which actually is more perceived than is actual. And the real risk management issues that I see are firstly the failure of PPE to work correctly, the failure of harnesses or helmets. So if somebody's got a non-standard body shape, does a standard harness work for them? Okay, that could be an issue. So a double leg amputee ain't going to sit in a sit harness if their amputations are above where the leg loops will sit. Okay, or the non-fitting or no size available, i.e. somebody's too large for a piece of kit, or it doesn't fit properly. And if it doesn't fit properly, it is not fit for purpose. Therefore, it shouldn't be used. Okay, again, classic example might be a helmet. Someone with hydrocephalus, large head, you know, they can't fit a standard helmet. If you haven't got it, what are you going to do about it? Okay, you need to look either for potentially alternative equipment with similar characteristics. So the use of something like a paragliding harness is a possibility if they can't fit a standard harness, or use of helmets. We can reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Go into a climbing wall where climbing helmet isn't needed. Go to an outdoor crowd where there's nobody above them, there's no loose stones. Therefore, we're reducing the probability of that risk happening. Okay, second issue I've got is the lack of physical capacity for the person to carry out the actions which are required. i.e. they don't have sufficient strength or functioning, or there's a danger of injury themselves to if they were to do something. Okay, this could be caused by fitness, fatigue, dietary issues, or drug needs. So how are we going to deal with this one? I think we've got to look at some kind of compensatory techniques. So let's take, I'm just going to give a quick example, someone abseiling and they may not have the strength in their hand and they may let go of the abseil rope. Okay, so compensatory techniques for this, obviously we'll have them on a safety rope anyway, but somebody could be standing below them to put tension on the rope to make sure there's sufficient friction going through the device for them. So there are things we can do, but we're obviously based on what their needs are. Next issue is the inability to understand, remember, or carry out the instructions which are required. So, you know, you can end up with people not remembering, for example, how to tie in properly, or how to fit a harness. So your mitigation needs to be looking at either from a comprehension point of view, if they can't understand what you're saying because they've got an intellectual impairment, how about using different wording or means of communication if they're deaf so that they actually have got that. If they can't remember, you know, how about assisting them in execution? Might have a staffing need issue, but you know, it's a possibility to help them remember. Or, you know, if they can't carry out the instructions at all, what are the options of avoiding the requirements, using a different piece of equipment which doesn't need them to do that? So for example, I'm just trying to think, you know, an ID belay device which becomes fail-safe rather than a gree-gree, which may not be. Okay. Behaviors that place the individual or others at risk, i.e., you know, people with behavior management issues. Okay, you're going to have to start managing the risk or the environment, going somewhere which is safe, possibly using staffing with skills who can help manage their behavior, equipment which they can't untie, the classic of having had somebody with a kind of behavior management issue unclip from an abseil by taking the carabiner off. But if you replace that with a Malon, which is cranked down with a spanner, that ain't going to happen. Okay, and have they got the right medication? Because that can make such a big difference. Okay, and the final one I've got is either the learning or psychological well-being of somebody, and that obviously applies across the whole gamut of our participants. You know, it could have an adverse impact, especially if things go wrong and they don't anticipate that. You know, people with autism are very focused on what is going to happen, and they may have to have spent time thinking about it. And if it doesn't go that way, that can be quite distressing for them. So, you know, from a mitigation point of view, make sure that the activity is age appropriate, that the individual is prepared, and if necessary, you know, is there a risk understanding by the participant? Are they willing? So, final one here ends up as the equipment. And I think this is quite important because the order of this is good. So many people, when they're looking at including people with disabilities, start at the equipment end, while actually the other three things we've just looked at, I think will give access to more people with disabilities than the equipment. Yes, the equipment can help, the equipment can be crucial, but is not the top of the tree, excuse the pun there, than the other elements. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about adapting equipment. Okay, I think there's an adaptive equipment hierarchy of what we should be using when we're using adaptive equipment. I think inclusive design, something which everybody can use, is the first thing which should be used. So can we select equipment which can be used by everybody? It's the ideal. Can't think of many good climbing examples here, but you know, rather than having a specialist piece of equipment which sits on one side and doesn't get used, buy equipment which can be used by as wide a range of people as possible. Thing again of thinking about would be something like a, you know, an ID. Everybody could use an ID, but it's an expensive option and it's not commonly used. So, you know, why would you? Alternative equipment from that sport. So again, these are both things which are designed for the sport. Something like a full body harness may work for somebody who has a double leg amputation, who may invert in a standard sit harness when they're suspended because of their upper body weight. Using a full body harness designed for purpose out of the sport would be a suitable alternative. Now we're coming into more controversial elements of something which is designed for an alternative use. And the classic example here, as I see it, is the paragliding harness. It is not designed for climbing activities. However, it is fit for purpose for many people. It is designed for a very similar activity with similar kind of stresses and suspended activities in it. Therefore, it may be totally fit for purpose to be used. Modifying equipment that you've got. People kind of start having apoplexy when you talk about modifying equipment. It depends what you do. It depends if it's critical safety equipment, and it depends if your modification is going to deteriorate the integral qualities of it or not. And again, I've got an example here, is if using a piece of caving equipment, the petzl stop, and making a modification of an extended handle on it, which will enable someone who can't grip the rope to be able to put pressure on the lever and then abseil independently using it. I'm sure the purists amongst you will tell us that you should always keep a hand on the dead rope when using a petzl stop, and I would agree with you entirely. It is not designed for that. However, I would suggest it is totally safe to work in that way, because the individual will be on a safety rope anyway. Here's another modified bit of equipment of an ascender with an iron bar passed through the lower carabiner hole, which somebody with just arm use could do pull-ups, and therefore ascend a rope using that when they wouldn't be able to apply sufficient pressure onto the original ascender. Making your own equipment, again, you know, starts getting towards the dodgy end, but is it critical safety equipment? So someone without sufficient grip could have, say, a bandage out of a first aid kit wrapped around their hand, which is giving them access or sufficient support and grip to enable them to hold on to a piece of equipment which they need to use. And finally, and quite challenging for some people, at the bottom of the list to me is the design engineered equipment, the specially made piece of kit. And my only reason for putting this down the bottom is that this can be a barrier to participation. There can be some fantastic bits of kits designed. I'll take the example is the kite harness, which is a piece of equipment designed to climb for people with disabilities. Why I don't like it is that it sits there unused for most of the time, unless you have a very high take up of users. It costs a vast amount of money, about £850, and most of the time it sits idle. And that person who uses it can only go somewhere where that piece of equipment is available. So if you can provide an alternative which doesn't involve that cost, and they can use it and transfer that learning back to their home environment, you've actually accessed the sport to that person rather than it becoming a barrier in itself. So 2 questions I ask here and keep on. Is it critical safety equipment? If so, it has to be fit for purpose. It has to do the job you want it to do. It doesn't have to be designed for purpose, but it must be fit for purpose. I have listed most of these as pros and cons on a sheet, and if you get the handout, that will be there. So it's just some things to think about if you wanted to spend a bit more time thinking about that as an element. So if you're adapting equipment, I see there's four questions one needs to ask here. Is what you're doing effective? If it's not effective, don't bother. Find something which is. Is it safe? If it isn't safe, it's not a question of not using it. It's a question of a benefit risk assessment. All of our activities we do in the mountains have a risk element to it. And we all know some of the benefits of that. So you've got to balance that risk benefit if the piece of equipment may not be entirely safe. And does the participant understand the additional risk they're taking by using that piece of equipment, which will enable them to access climbing or mountaineering against not doing the activity at all? And the other 2 questions are, is it simple? I much prefer something simple. because it's normally easy to make, modify and repair? And finally, has it got a low cost? If it hasn't got a low cost, it might become a barrier to participation. So that's our tree. I'm just going to leave you with a final thought on you as providers, us as providers, accessing some activities for people. And I think there's three elements we need to take into account. Firstly, the activity we're doing. Secondly, the people we're working with. And thirdly, the equipment we have available. And I see these things as being interdependent, sorry, okay. So if you have a bunch of participants coming to join you and they want to do a specific activity, you may require certain equipment. So, for example, let's take Karen Dark, who's a lady with spinal cord injury who wanted to climb El Cap with Andy Fitzpatrick. What did they need? They needed a set of Jumaring equipment that Karen could use, and they needed a paragliding harness. Without those, she couldn't do that climb. In the same way, you may have a bunch of participants, you may have some equipment, and that combination of the participants and equipment may guide you towards the activity you can do. So again, if we take the example of somebody with hydrocephalus who can't use a helmet, therefore you have no helmet which fits, the activity they've got to do may be going to the climbing wall instead of an outside venue. So finally, the last one is that you've got yourself as a provider, you're a climbing provider, you have standard equipment. Well, that may limit you to the participants you can have in your activity. And they may be somebody who's got a hearing impairment or ADHD or autism or whatever it is, people who don't require special equipment because you don't have it. And of course, the question then comes is, would it be reasonably practicable as an expectation for you to have some equipment? I can't answer that one. So, folks, that's my little spider diagram to end with. Everything's dependent on everything else. Graham, if there's any particular questions, should I take them now or should we leave that to the end?
We'll leave it to the end, John, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine. Folks, thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thanks, John.
That's your break now, isn't it, Graham?
Right. Thank you very much. Thanks, John. That was really good. Really enjoyed that first hour. So just a quick recap on my part of the session. It's going to be a little bit more practical based. Yeah, because John's a doctor and I'm not. That's mainly why. And we're going to look at the session to look mainly at gathering information on people and how we can use this effectively. And we'll use this in some breakout sessions. We're also going to look in more detail at mountain training's position on disability with some examples of good practice, and also talking a little bit more detail about what supporting resources are out there if you fancy working with somebody with a disability, or you may be doing it already, or just developing what the existing knowledge that you've got. Okay, just some figures around disability. These are really interesting. This doesn't cover mountaineering, it covers sports in general. There's an organisation called Activity Alliance that's funded through Sport England that do lots of research and insight into sports. But just have a read through some of those figures. There's some really interesting ones. Things like only 24% of instructors feel confident about providing an activity for a disabled person. 84% of providers have no experience of running sessions for disabled people. So yeah, it was done relatively recently, this research, and it's still showing you know, figures like that. There's still quite a lot of work to do out there. Okay, this is quite an important point here. Lots and lots of times I've had lots of meetings with mountain training, with Mark and Guy, and you know, and I fully respect this whole position, because it's like the point that John made earlier about activities. Don't undermine an activity. You know, don't take away its core, the fundamental parts of that activity. So again, this paragraph's really important, illustrating that we can't compromise things and can't deliver things unsafely. And as John has said a whole number of times as well, the natural outdoors isn't particularly accessible. And also we have talked about there are high levels of risk attached in a number of the activities that we deliver. And just another interesting point about the natural outdoors, that I would say the vast majority of disabled people that I've spoken to who go into the outdoors don't want us to start changing that environment. They want it to stay as it is, because again, it would be undermining the reasons why you're actually going into the outdoors. Okay, there might be some small changes that you can make, but it's not about undermining it completely. Okay, so yeah, John talked about risk in the outdoors. He talked a bit about perceived risk, and also talked about actual risk. And I'm going to cover this topic more comprehensively, because in all the years that I've been working in both sports and the outdoors, it's the topic that crops up the most often, and that is right across the whole spectrum. It's not just your participants or the family members, it's instructors, it might be insurers, it might be even GPs might be involved in that, and it's just yeah, things around the anxiety that suddenly arises when you're talking about accessible activities and working with disabled people. Okay. Yeah, we are going to talk about risk assessments. I've just put this paragraph at the bottom of my page here about sometimes risk assessments may be carried out inappropriately, but what quite often happens is that a disabled person might not even be factored into the activity, so might not have even had a risk assessment created for themselves, or the session plan might not even include the disabled person. So before risks are even considered, that person may not have been considered it themselves in the activity. Okay. Right, so I'm just going to talk through a few parts of building up your sessions, or whether you're going to train somebody or qualify somebody or coach somebody. Just again, with regards to my presentation, it might look a little bit more focused on the instructing side of things. I don't actually have any coaching qualifications, but I do know that there are a lot of people on this course that are actual coaches as well. So it doesn't exclude coaches from the learning process in what we're doing now. It's all incorporated. Okay. So right, this I've already quoted something from Mountain Training. This is another quote that they've got in their section on accessible activities. So it's a really important point, and we're going to build on this in more detail. Please make course providers aware of any additional needs that you have at a booking stage. This may involve talking to them about any mental or physical disabilities. Right, that's a really important point, is that involve talking to them about mental or physical disabilities. Okay. you know, again, it's many assumptions can be made, but the way that you can find out about a person is through talking to them, and there may be a different set of systems attached to that. You might not talk directly to the participant. You might actually be talking to somebody who's a support worker for that person or a family member. Okay. Right, so I have got some examples of some information forms here, and I don't, you know, each of you as course providers will have different ways of getting information from people, but I just wanted to, it's something that does crop up an awful lot about gathering information from people, and how forms can be quite sort of limiting, and can maybe present information in the wrong way. So right, I've got an information form from ROCT Jim here. I don't know if anybody here is working for them or is a manager of that centre. I'm just using it purely as an example of an information form. Right, this is a registration form. It's not necessarily kind of reflect the kind of information that you will be getting if you were a course provider. Obviously, it's got the essential stuff in there, and it has got questions around whether you can do the specific tasks attached to what the activity is. But it's just, I'm not, this isn't a criticism of this form in any way whatsoever, but it doesn't really sort of provide any opportunities to sort of talk in more detail about what a person's impairment might be. Okay, I was trying to find other forms that I've seen where it maybe talks about a disability in quite a negative way, seeing it as being a problem rather than an opportunity. Okay, so like I said, I'm not criticizing that form. Okay, and so what I'll do now is bring up another example. Okay, so yeah, I was involved in an activity program when I worked for a leisure trust, and we worked with young disabled people on that, with whole different varieties of different disabilities within that. And right, again, we were working with the people on a regular basis, so we did have the time to gather this information. Okay, I understand that there may be time limitations at times when you're putting things together, but it is important to engage with those people to find out what their abilities are and what may be, for example, triggers in behaviour. So again, it's asking for the essential detail, emergency contacts and things like that. But it just leaves a lot more room for just open discussion about a person. Okay, there are some prompts in there like communication, mobility and physical ability, self-care. And this is, you know, talking about behaviour, for example, if somebody is autistic or has a learning disability. So questions like triggers for behaviour. Okay, and crucially, it leaves a big box at the end there. You might not actually put anything at all in this part here. It might be just in this part here at the in the any other notes. Okay, and I in all the 11 years I was running that program, because it was young people, it was parents that were completing those forms. I never got one parent who was reluctant to assist in filling that form out. They were very supportive of it because they wanted a person-centered approach to the person that we were supporting. Right, risk assessments. Risk assessment should be developed, should be reflective of the person's ability with assessment, not based on generalizations of disabilities. Again, it's quite a common thing, this, around making assumptions around a person's disability. What I'll say is a good thing to do is actually develop some risk assessments with maybe some generalizations within that, but really your risk assessment should be based around the individual. Okay, so I've just put some examples of generalizations in there. So autistic person has very little awareness of danger, potential to climb rocks without protection, risk of falling resulting in serious injury or death. Okay. You probably all know this, that there are many different levels of autism. It's a very, very broad spectrum. And so each person with autism has to be assessed on an individual basis as part of that. Again, learning disabled person, high risk of harness not being fitted correctly with consequence of serious injury or death. Again, there's lots of different levels of learning disability. Person with spinal cord injury cannot participate in the activity of, that's supposed to say B lane, a person because they may be at risk of causing serious injury or death. Again, a spinal injury could be a very low break, and that person could have incredibly strong arms, or even somebody with a slightly higher break might still have some arm strength there. So it's down to an individual assessment of that person. Person with epilepsy, role of lowering a person. It's quite a common one, is epilepsy. Last training I attended, it was quite a few years ago, but there's something like 350 types of epilepsy. So it might be somebody who can give you a very, very clear indication of when they're going to have a seizure, or it might even be 2 years since they last had a seizure, and it might only be a very moderate seizure. Okay, so I talked about it being a practical session. We're going to have to go through a few things here before we do break out. It's what I'd like us to do is, using John's first hour and just all your existing knowledge as course providers, is look at some considerations that you would make if a person with a disability wanted to come and do a course with you. Okay. And when I talk about a disability, so one of the groups is going to have somebody who's autistic, but I haven't indicated what part of the spectrum they're on. But you could put in a few considerations based on different levels of autism into your session plan as part of that. Okay. So what we're going to do is split off into 4 groups. The title of the disability and the activity I'm going to ask you to put together will be on the group title. And if I can ask one person to report back on what you've discussed within that group when we come back into the room, you'll be getting 10 minutes to do this bit of work. And something to add into it, I'd really like to see some really imaginative thought around this. So just to give an example, I do know that like Laura May is doing her Lowland Leaders Award at the moment, and well, she was up until recently. She's had another accident. Laura's a chair user, and I thought if I perhaps wanted to attract more chair users onto a walking program, to have a walk leader who is a chair user will provide a good motivator for that. So I'm looking for some answers like that, as broad as as much the safety responses that we get through that. So the groups are, it's scenario 1 with person with visual impairment wants to do their climbing wall instructor training. Group 2, wheelchair user would like to do their lone leader training. Group 3, autistic person wants to do their mountain leader training. Scenario 4, person with epilepsy would like to do their indoor climbing assistant. Yeah. So thanks for that. I actually went into a group. It was very interesting discussion. So what I'll do is, I know we're sort of limited time wise, is just maybe get a feedback from a couple of people. So if we could have some feedback from the group that did visual impairment wants to do their climbing wall instructors award. Have we got anybody who can provide some feedback from there?
We talked a bit about the different kind of ways that you would prepare for the course, adding in extra lead time, meeting someone individually finding out lots more information about what the extra requirements might be, and just what their previous experience was, the kind of wall that they'd climbed in, and that kind of thing. And we talked about once you were going ahead with the course, talking to the group and making the whole thing like a bit of a collective responsibility, both for the provider and all the participants. And we, like any specific adaptations, we were saying was kind of pretty specific to what, I mean, visual impairment's a pretty wide term. So we were saying that would depend very much on what was actually involved. But yeah, that was
okay.
pretty much it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kat. Anybody else want to just provide a little bit of feedback on different area?
So that was the wheelchair user on learn and leader training.
Okay, I'm going to jump in there just in case there's a delay. Yeah, no, it's a useful conversation.
Cheers, John. Thank you very much for that.
There was a number of points brought up. I mean, obviously, route choices being accessible were incredibly important. Again, the cheap win was the role model, but again, if not the role model as the provider, even to bring in someone like an assistant leader to help to work as a role model could be incredibly valuable. Really important to have a conversation with the candidate regarding the syllabus and their capacity, particularly with respect to the prerequisites and their logbook experience, that they're up to standards. It was Jay's kind of comments that, you know, he seems to have enough candidates turning up who aren't disabled, who can't meet the prerequisites or not fit enough for some of the Hill and Moorland awards, that making sure that people are fit enough. But using Laura as an example, very aware that if somebody like that turns up, they'll be more than prepared for the event. Comment about different chairs as well, that maybe it'd be nice to have a range of chairs to try. Don't think that'd be actually a reasonable expectation from my point of view, but it'd be a really nice thing to have if the person, you know, you hopefully will be in a chair which is suitable, but if not, you know, yeah, it gives them some guidance. And finally, in the conversation ended up with incident management and how they would manage incidents themselves as an important part of the training to be prepared for assessment, because, you know, again, it's that competency assessment, isn't it? They're being asked to do it, you know, they've got to have some method of demonstrating their competence. I think, hopefully, guys, that reflects what you were saying.
I'll just give a little bit of feedback. We did autism and mountain leader training, and interestingly, one of the points that was raised, that if somebody's got high function autism, that it will actually could potentially contribute quite significantly to the actual training in terms of like map skills, reading weather, planning.
Sorry, we're struggling with the connection here.
Yeah.
Can you hear us, Graham? Might be worth turning your camera off.
Well, we've lost Graham. Is any of the other groups able to report back to share their experiences?
I'll jump in where Graham left off. We discussed that somebody with high functioning autism coming onto the course may have better skills than some of the people without any disability or anything like that, and therefore wouldn't be compromised at all by coming on to a training course. Or we also discussed the limitations of somebody going through for assessment, and that they have to conform or meet national standards and the standards of the qualification, which I think is what you just said about the what Jay was talking about on the climbing. But we also said that having somebody with a disability, in our case it was autism, on the course would enrich the course as well, them having more awareness of that particular disability and maybe other disabled people as well.
Right,
Thanks for that, Cliff.
So with epilepsy on an indoor climbing assistant.
Am I
Yeah,
there?
I can hear you now.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Okay. Yeah, we did epilepsy and the Indoor Climbing Wall Assistant Award. And we just talked about how information was really important to know as much about the individual person as possible. So what their triggers might be and the frequency and severity of epilepsy. And with all that information, we could then make like an individual risk assessment or plan. And we'd ask the candidate themselves what support they might need to help them, you know, achieve that award. And then depending on the severity or what kind of epilepsy they had, we might want to build in some safety backups. So for example, we have adapt a bit of equipment, maybe use like a rig instead of, I don't know, a gree or something like that, that had an extra safety backup in it, or use another member of staff if need be. You know, so if something went wrong, you had that extra person. And the other thing that was really important was really good communication between the candidate and the rest of the people on the course. So if they did have an episode, everyone would know what was going on and what to do. That was it.
Okay. Right. Thanks for that. Thanks very much, Mel. Have we finished there? I'll return to the slideshow now. Okay. Kath, can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Sorry. Right. So yeah, that was great. Some great responses from that. Just a little bit about engaging people in activities. Again, going back to the outdoors not being the most accessible place, so presents more challenges around that. But there are particular ways of trying to engage people in the activities themselves. It may be an individual comes forward and asks to do a qualification, or making contact with disability organisations. What is evolving quite a lot is hubs, disability hubs. Like, for example, there's one in Sheffield, there's one evolving in Manchester. So that's there to support more disabled people into not just participating in the sport, but taking a more active role. You've got things like the paraclimbing events. So, for example, John Churcher, who was part of the GB paraclimbing team, has now done his Climbing Wall Instructors Award. Things like disability festivals, which the British Mountaineering Council fund. So just going along to events like that. Okay, and you can always, get in touch with us to see if we can signpost any people. Okay, we had just in our discussion around an autistic person doing the mountain leaders qualification. I think it might have been Chris who started talking about a person doing their SPA when it was called the SPA, and there are actually awards now that offer different avenues. For example, like the indoor climbing assistant. I don't know if we've got any providers along today, but if somebody can't actually complete their Climbing Wall Instructors Award or Rock Climbing Instructors Award, they can do something like this, which will still give them a pivotal role in that session, but will accommodate their abilities as part of that session. So I've talked about Laura May. She actually passed her Indoor Climbing Assistant Award, and then proceeded to go on to do start doing her Lowland Leaders Award as part of that. So the Indoor Climbing Assistant Award is a very new course, actually, so it's really good. We will be sending this PowerPoint out, so I have got some hyperlinks on here. There's some really good stuff that Mountain Training have got up on their website, which is an overarching statement about accessibility, guidelines on reasonable adjustments, and just some really good examples of good working practice where people have passed their awards. So we'll send that out. And I'll just talk in about support networks out there. So the BMC have got an equity steering group, which John mentioned earlier on in his presentation. That is now, it used to be one group, but it's now got subgroups that meet, and there is one for disability, and there's a lot of very experienced people in that group. And another recent development that I've agreed with Amy is to have a group of technical advisors, a small group of technical advisors on accessible activities within the newly formed database. We're still in the process of putting that together, but if technical questions are raised with the equity steering group, we'll be able to feed into advice from that subgroup as well. And if you do want questions answering, we do hope to have a very quick turnaround on anything like that as well. We're in the process of putting a new Climbing for All booklet, which we hope to get out in March next year, which will have a much bigger range of chapters than what the current booklet has, including things such as coaching, competitions, and a little bit more in-depth detail around models of disability as well. And yeah, Climbing for All course, obviously a bit limited in delivering that at the moment. So that's half a day theory and half a day practical work. And we've also got a bit of an evolving thing where it's just to illustrate that all the key sort of organisations that are involved in climbing and mountaineering activities are working jointly together and working consistently in their aims, so that when we do come up with an answer for people, that answer is consistent and is positive as well. Okay, that's it. We've done.
Brilliant.
Finished.
Thank you very much, Graham. and
Yeah,
John.
Thanks, Guy.
It was, yeah, no, really illuminating, and you guys are the experts. Yeah, unless anyone's got any burning questions, I'd just like to say thank you very much. We'll all go away and have a little think about what we can do. It is, as I've said in pretty much every workshop up to now, it's about supporting people, particularly candidates, to get as far as they can and to achieve the best they can. So we're here to try and support people and make those reasonable adjustments where necessary. Thanks all.
In terms of our PowerPoint, Guy, obviously you'll be contacting everybody who's attended, and we can just attach our stuff to. Yeah, so can we send our stuff through to you so it goes out? Yes,
I've been having discussions today with officers, and I think what we've agreed to do is that all these sessions are recorded and they will be made available. Obviously, that means you've got to sit down for 2 hours and go through them if you wanted every bit. But we'll also archive somewhere on the website the PDFs of your presentations, which I think everybody has sent in. And then we'll send the links to everybody so that they can access them later. Just give us a little bit of time. Kath's absolutely snowed under with
it's not a problem. It's
work to sort all this out, but that's what we intend to do. And then we've got that bank of resource for people should they want to get back to the presentation.
Thanks Guy.
All right,
and thank you very much to everybody for attending. Greatly appreciate that.
Okay, great stuff. All right, well, yeah, sorry about the slightly wobbly connection at the end. I imagine that's all the kids coming back from school, getting on their PS4s. But I think we will probably need to go off for a cup of tea now or something stronger. So thanks very much. It's been brilliant.
Right. Okay. Cheers.
Great, thanks. Bye.